Can you be born evil? That was the question the British public asked as 11-year-old Mary Bell stood in court in Newcastle, England in 1968. Everything about Mary seemed completely typical of a girl her age, except for the fact that she had murdered 2 people. The country had never seen anything quite like it. This pretty young girl was called a bad seed like no other, a vicious psychopath, a calculating and cruel beast. Yet on the outside, she was sweet and innocent. The question then on everyone's mind was, can psychopaths be cured? Can heartless killers of children ever be trusted when they become adults? That's something you can tell us once you've heard all the details. Mary Bell was born on May 26, 1957. She grew up about 3 miles outside the city of Newcastle in the suburb of Scotswood. This was a rough and tumble area where many of the men worked in coal mines and factories, where unemployment and violent crime and alcoholism were rife, where day-to-day living was as hard as it got in Great Britain. Young kids spent much of their time in the streets, playing among the bricks and stones and broken glass of boarded-up, derelict houses. This is where Mary and her friend and neighbor Norma, also named Bell but not related, changed the face of British crime in the summer of 1968. For many in Great Britain, this was another so-called summer of love, but the streets of Scotswood were a far cry from the colorful TV images Americans saw of Britain in the swinging 60s. Scotswood wasn't swinging. It was sinking into a mire of abject poverty and urban decay, where working-class kids ran around with filthy faces and mischief on their minds. 4-year-old Martin Brown was one of them. He lived around the corner from White House Road at 140 Margaret's Road. Martin's family was impoverished, but his parents, June and Georgie, kept their house neat and tidy. They spoiled Martin, giving him as much as a child could expect living in such urban squalor. Still, compared to 2024, kids like Martin were given almost no parental guidance. They were products of the street no sooner than they hit 3. On May 25th, Martin woke up early. It was a Sunday, and June and Georgie liked to stay in bed late on the weekends. Martin got up at 6:30 a.m. and went to the room where his 1-year-old sister Linda was sleeping on her cot. As usual, he got some bread and milk and fed Linda, being careful not to wake his parents. When June and Georgie got out of bed around 9, Martin had already dressed Linda. He told his parents he was going to go out to play. Little did they know, he would never return. 2 men working in one of the houses being demolished saw Martin a bit later walking in the streets, his blue coat fastened up for what looked like another rainy day. Martin's Aunt Rita saw him at about 11 a.m. when he visited her house further down St. Margaret's Road. As usual, he'd walked in through the open door. Rita woke up in a fright. Martin was standing right over her. She wasn't happy about being woken up, not on the day she usually slept late, and she shouted at him to get out. Rita's mom, who was downstairs, took pity on Martin and cooked him an egg on toast. He was still teary-eyed when Rita finally got up and came downstairs. He didn't like being shouted at, not by Rita, who he dearly loved. She apologized and all was good when he left her house a few minutes later. That same morning, Mary Bell, 10, and Norma Bell, 13, made an appearance at Rita's house. Rita adored Norma because she often came around and took her 3-year-old son John off her hands, taking him out to play in the streets. But Rita didn't much like Mary, a sneaky girl who often had an air of mischief about her. Rita shouldn't have allowed those girls anywhere near her son. Martin was out of the house for hours. At around 3 p.m., he was seen with other little boys in Mr. Dixon's shop, where the lads often went to buy candy. Mr. Dixon remembered shouting at Martin that day. Martin's hands were filthy from playing in the abandoned houses, yet he had them in his mouth. After Dixon admonished him, Martin bought a lollipop from the sweet tray. Martin went back round to Rita's house. He was now completely covered in dirt, so she told him to get a wash. He asked if he could have his dinner at her house later in the day. For now, he had a slice of bread with margarine, not butter, since Rita was saving the butter for Sunday tea. Martin was upset about this. He hated margarine. He turned to her and shouted, "I'm not coming to your house no bloody more," and he stormed out in a huff. At around 3:30 p.m., workers in another of the condemned houses on the street saw Martin again. Across the street, 3 boys aged 16, 14, and 8 were collecting scrap wood from the partly demolished houses so they could build a pigeon coop. One of the boys suddenly let out a scream loud enough for the workmen to hear. They walked into the house where one of the boys, his face ashen white, told them to go into one of the bedrooms upstairs. The workmen found a boarded-up window. Below it was a bit of gravel, and on the gravel was the body of a young boy. It was Martin. His arms were stretched to his side. Blood and saliva dripped from his mouth. One of the workmen, John Hall, later said, "We knew him right away. They'd given Martin some cookies earlier in the day. The men called an ambulance." John later testified, "I gave the boy the kiss of life. I just held him in my arms all the time. He looked dead to me. His body was cold. The two older teenage boys, Walter and Fred, felt like they would pass out. They went to another room to calm down, and that's when they looked out of the window and saw two girls with dark hair walking down the street. The two girls stopped at the window where the boys were standing. Walter knew one of them. Her name was Mary Bell. Walter later testified that he met Mary and Norma on the stairs, and he told them she couldn't come any further because there was something awful in the house. Mary said she already knew, but he wouldn't let her pass. Mary and Norma then walked over to Rita's house. Rita was cooking sausages and had just put curlers in her hair when Mary said that she'd better come outside. Mary told her, "One of your sister's kids has just had an accident. We think it's Martin, but we can't tell because there's blood all over him." This was a slight exaggeration, but the girls were more than happy to ignite Rita's distress. Rita, hysterical, left the sausages in the pan and ran to the house with Mary. Rita pushed Mary out of the way. Martin was lying on the floor. A man was above him, still trying to resuscitate him. Rita cried out, "He's asleep, that's all. He'll wake up in a second." By this time, someone had already run to Martin's house and told June and Georgie. When June turned up at the condemned house, Rita was still hysterical, still saying Martin was asleep and would wake up. June later testified, "I knew he was dead." The question was, what had happened? How had her son had an accident in an empty bedroom? If he'd hit his head, how? Had he run across the room and slipped? It didn't seem likely. There was a hole in the ceiling, but it was on the other side of the room from where Martin's body had been found. It was unlikely anything had fallen on him, so how does a boy just die like that? This would become a mystery with a dark and fascinating twist only emerging decades later. Later that night, pathologist Dr. Bernhard Knight said he couldn't determine the cause of death. He said that Martin had been in very good health. There were no injuries on his body except a small bruise on his knee. A young, healthy boy had seemingly passed out and died for no reason. Knight said it could have possibly been poison. In the house, empty bottles had been found. Maybe Martin had drunk from one of the bottles and it had contained some kind of noxious cleaning agent, but the autopsy suggested this was not the case. There was, of course, asphyxiation. Had Martin been strangled by someone? But if he had, he'd surely had no bruises on his neck. And Dr. Knight couldn't find any sign that someone had applied force to Martin's neck. His death was ruled an accident, which meant that detectives from the CID didn't join the investigation. And that was it. June and Georgie had to live with the fact that their son had somehow just passed out and died for no good reason. The next day, Sunday, Norma and Mary visited Rita again. Rita was still shaken up, so the girls said they'd take her son John off her hands for a while. At first, Rita thought how very kind this was of them. She often struggled on Sundays with her 4 children when there was a lot of cooking to do. Sundays were always busy, not least because this was the day all the family took their weekly bath, usually sharing the same water to save electricity. Mary and Norma showed up at Rita's every day after that, taking little John into the streets. But something started to bother Rita. Mary kept asking her, "Do you miss Martin? Do you cry for him?" Rita found it strange when they smiled one time and asked, "Does June miss Martin?" The girls were grinning from ear to ear. Rita later said, "I could stand it no more and I told them to get out and not come back." For the life of her, she had no idea why they'd mess with her emotions like that. We now know Rita had underestimated the parameters of the expression "children can be cruel." It had been Mary's 11th birthday on May 26, the day after Martin's death. That day, she'd taken her Alsatian dog out to the park. All the kids were scared of the dog, especially Susan, Norma's 11-year-old sister. Mary and Susan were alone in the park when Mary asked Susan, "Where's my birthday card?" Susan said, "I don't know, but I definitely sent you one." Mary called her a liar. She flew at Susan in a rage, clasping her hands around her neck. Susan could barely breathe but managed to wriggle herself free. She ran, after which Mary told her Alsatian to get her. Susan had never been so scared her whole life. When she got to her house door, her mom heard her screams. She opened the door to see Mary with her hands around her daughter's neck. She hit Mary's hands away and shouted at her, "What's wrong with that girl?" The next day, Monday the 27th, teachers at the local nursery turned up to the school and discovered that someone had broken into the classrooms. Vandals had gotten in through the roof. They'd kicked a few things around and sprayed chemical agents on the floor. Books had been ripped up. The chairs and the desks had all been kicked over. Curiously, the police found pieces of paper on the floor with childish writing scrawled on them, writing that seemed to confess to a certain little boy's murder. It was hard to tell if the message was purposefully cryptic or merely the scribblings of a barely literate child who'd perhaps grown up with foul-mouthed adults. The cops thought the notes were just a prank by the local kids. They stored the pieces of paper at the station and helped the nursery install an alarm system. That same day in school, the kids in Mary's class, 40 in total, were asked to write about their weekend in the newsbook. Mary drew a picture of a dead child and wrote about Martin's death and the fact that she'd been nearby at the time. She was the only student in the class to mention it. Mary had been acting strange in class for some time now. She would sometimes violently shake her head from side to side for no good reason. She'd just stare at another student with what could only be described as rage written on her face, and then she would attack the student. The teachers always knew when an attack was imminent. These teachers might have well assumed that Mary was traumatized by Martin's death. That's partly what Martin's mom June thought. When 4 days after Martin had died, Mary turned up at her house and, after knocking on the door, said, "I want to see Martin." "Martin's dead," said June, suppressing the urge to cry. "I know," said Mary. "I just want to see him in his coffin." Mary wasn't traumatized, June noticed. She was grinning. June slammed the door in her face. What an absolutely wretched little girl, she thought. Rumors were already circulating about Mary and Norma being kids with a nasty streak. Earlier that same month, before Martin's death, 3-year-old John, Rita's son, had been found wandering around St. Margaret's Road with blood dripping down his face from a cut on his head. John had later told the police that he'd been with Mary and Norma, playing on a disused air raid shelter when the girls pushed him off. Police measured the drop at about 7 feet. It could have killed him, but it wasn't clear if John had just fallen and was confused about being pushed. That same evening, 3 local girls said they were out playing in the sandpit when Mary and Norma got hold of them. They said the girls put their hands around their necks and tried to strangle them. Police then went to see Mary and Norma. In the statement Mary gave about John, she said, "We went through the grass and through the fence and found John staggering around behind the sheds. He had bleeding from his head and had been sick all over his coat." She said that she didn't know he'd hurt himself. Norma's statement was similar. As for the girls, Cindy, Pauline, Wendy, and Susan, all age either 6 or 7, they said Mary had attacked them. Pauline told the police, "The girl took her hands off my neck, and she did the same to Susan. Me, Cindy, and Susan all ran home. The girl who squeezed my neck had short dark hair. I don't know this girl and had not seen her before." In Mary's statement, she denied any wrongdoing. In fact, she kind of blamed Norma. Her statement read, "When I was behind the shed, I heard Pauline scream. I came from behind the shed and I saw Pauline running away toward the fence. She was holding her throat and screaming. I asked Norma what had happened and she said that Pauline had fallen and hurt her throat on the edge of the sandpit." Norma's statement was more revealing. She told the cops. Then Mary went to the other girl and said, "What happens if you choke someone? Do they die?" Then Mary put both hands around the girl's throat and squeezed. The girl started to go purple. I told Mary to stop, but she wouldn't. She did this for a while and then she put her hands around Pauline's throat and she started going purple as well. Both Pauline and the other girl were crying. Another girl, Susan Cornish, came up and Mary did the same to her. We guess Mary and Norma were not adherents to the expression, "snitches get stitches," because they remained good friends after that. The police were somewhat taken aback. If this was true, a cute little girl had seemingly tried to throttle to death a bunch of other little girls. Even in the darkest depths of Newcastle, then with some of the highest rates of violence in England, that was highly unusual. The police wrote a caution which said these girls' bell have been warned as to their future conduct. On May 31st, the police at the local station were called to the nursery again. The alarm that they'd helped install had just gone off. When they were there, 2 girls were in the yard, Mary and Norma Bell. Both were charged with breaking and entering, a case that would go to the juvenile court in a few months. These girls were now becoming quite problematic. The cops wanted to speak to Mary's mom and dad. Strange people we'll discuss in detail later. The father, Billy, said that he'd keep a tight leash on Mary, but he didn't. As for the mother, Betty, as usual, she wasn't around. This incredibly peculiar woman lived a life of mystery, something that would take many years to unravel. About a week later, a 12-year-old boy was in the nursery sandpit when he saw Mary and Norma playing. He later told his parents that Norma was running when Mary tripped her up. She then sat on Norma's chest and started scratching her face. "I'm a murderer," Mary screamed with a look of glee and madness etched into her features. The boy thought this was funny, until Mary stood up, pulled back Norma's head by her hair, and kicked her hard right in the eye. Mary, who you know had just turned 11, was much smaller than Norma, but she was definitely the toughest of the two. The boy, now freaked out, looked Mary in the eye. With a nasty expression on her face, she pointed at the derelict house where Martin had been found and told him, "That's where I did it. That's where I killed Brown." The boy smiled nervously, urine almost breaching the walls of his bladder, and he ran away. Martin's death was an accident, that's what everyone thought. They were annoyed at the state of the streets, at all the broken houses, the vermin, the industrial mess that they called home. Parents marched protesting about the dangers of the condemned houses. Mary walked down the street holding a banner that said, "Tenants want action, not excuses." Under no circumstances, despite her dalliances with extreme violence, did anyone for a second think Mary and Norma might have been behind Martin's early demise. There was, however, a lot of anger aimed at the government from a people who seemed to be constantly at war with pitifully low wages and horrid living conditions. Their focus was not on Mary and her friend at this point. The Howe family knew all about crappy living conditions. They had 5 kids to feed. The father worked long hours, and the mother, after living in the damp house and subsisting on bread and butter, spent much of her life sick in the hospital. Like many local women, she was overworked and nutritionally deficient, just as many of the kids were. It was fortunate for Mr. Howe that he had his 14-year-old daughter, Pat, whose role had morphed into being the mother of the younger kids, while the real mom was in the hospital. That same summer, Pat was running around cooking and cleaning when Mary showed up at the house. The younger kids were home, as was Pat's brother and his girlfriend, Irene. Mary went to the living room and told Irene she had a secret. "Okay, go on then, tell me everything," Irene said, thinking Mary was about to tell her one of her tall tales. Mary said it was about Martin's death. Norma put her hands on his throat, Mary said, explaining that Norma squeezed and squeezed and squeezed until the life force inside little Martin left him. In such a small community, word traveled fast. All the neighbors were soon saying that little Mary Bell was telling tales about her best friend Norma Bell. How could she say such things? No one believed Mary, of course. Little girls don't murder people. Mary got a telling off for spreading lies. She was soon around at Norma Bell's house apologizing to Norma's parents for making up such sick stories. Brian Howe, Pat's younger brother, was 3 years and 4 months old. Small in frame with a pinkish complexion, he was the proverbial bundle of joy. He liked to play a lot with Rita's son John, and that meant that Brian often came into contact with Mary and Norma. They often took John off Rita's hands and they took Brian off Pat's hands, so they were well-liked kids by the adults, despite being mischievous at times. Rita loved Pat, who was 14 going on 40, a responsible young woman who'd given up school to help her dad. Some days Pat would go round to Rita's and take John and Brian to the nursery, and sometimes Rita would take them. On July 31st, it was Rita's turn to take the kids, but when she went round to Pat's house, no one answered the door. She walked John to the nursery and Brian wasn't there either. She figured Pat must have slept in. She was right. Later that day, about 1:30 p.m., Rita went to pick up John and she found John and Brian together watching some demolition men pull down one of the houses. She shouted at the workmen, telling them the bricks could have hit the kids. They shouldn't have allowed them so close. Rita later said, "I went mad. I screamed at the men and said they didn't know better. A brick could fall down and kill them. How could they let them sit there?" Once Rita calmed down, she put John to bed early without any supper and stuffed some cookies into Brian's pants pockets. She told him that he should explain to Pat. After all, Martin had died in one of those houses. He might have only been 3, but he should have known better than to hang around next to those dangerous, dilapidated places. Rita didn't see Brian again, not that day, not ever. At about 2 o'clock, he was seen with his pet dog Lassie, playing with some girls who were riding bicycles. A little later, Mary and Norma knocked on Rita's house door. "Where's my boyfriend?" Mary joked, meaning John. Rita explained that he wouldn't be playing out today. He'd been sent to bed early for playing in one of the houses. It was a beautiful day and still very early. Rita later admitted, "I almost got John up and let him go out to play with the girls." She would be eternally glad that she hadn't. Pat got home at about 3:30 p.m. and asked where Brian was. Irene was home and told her that he'd gone out to play. At about 4, Pat's father told her to go find Brian and bring him home for tea. Pat went out, first stopping at Maxime's house. Maxime was Norma Bell's neighbor. Norma was there, as was Mary. After Pat asked them if they'd seen Brian, Mary asked if she could help her look for him. Norma got on her bicycle and said she'd also join the search party, but Norma later went off by herself. What Norma and Mary did that afternoon would become the utmost importance in the near future. After asking some boys if they'd seen Brian, Mary beckoned Pat to go to a place where all the kids often hung out, outside a shop named Davies. There weren't many places for kids to do things in Scottswood. Davies was one of the regular haunts, as was a car park near the railway lines. Brian wasn't at any of these places, which only left the wasteland known as the Tin Lizzie. This was a stretch of land filled with junk, car parts, bricks, tires, rusty oil drums, smashed doors, and shards of broken glass. It was a dump, but for working-class kids it was an industrial adventure playground. They loved it there, despite the many cuts and bruises they incurred. Mary said to Pat, "Maybe he's over there," and she pointed at some big concrete blocks, building materials that had been dumped so long ago grass and weeds had grown all around them. Pat told Mary that Brian wouldn't go down there. It was too dangerous, and Brian knew better. Mary said, "Okay, let's go to the next place." The hours passed, and still there was no sign of Brian. Close to 7 p.m., Pat told Mary she was going to call the police. They looked everywhere. Pat's boyfriend by this time had also joined the search. Norma went off with a girl named Linda and said that she wouldn't join the search again this evening. She didn't seem concerned at all that Brian was missing. Pat was appreciative of Mary, who kept looking. But then at 7:30, Billy, Mary's father, called Mary in for supper. Mary was in bed when Brian was found. At precisely 11:10 p.m. that same night, he was exactly where Mary had asked Pat to look, in between huge concrete blocks on the Tin Lizzie. He was lying motionless in a mass of weeds, one of his arms pointing away from him, his hand black with dirt. At his side was a pair of scissors. One of the blades was bent and the other had snapped off. His lips were blue. There was blood-colored saliva all around his mouth, and there were some scratches around his face. This time, it seemed obvious that someone had had their hands around his neck. You could see the bruising. He was dead. He obviously had been dead for quite a few hours. The whole town had been looking for him, but not Mary's mom and dad. Rita and Martin's mom, June, had led the search with Pat, making sure to keep everyone in cups of tea and Spam sandwiches. After stopping for a break, they'd gone out again, and it was on this second run that Brian's body was found. At about 11:30, Mary woke up to the sound of police car sirens. She went downstairs and asked her dad what was going on. "They found Brian Howe," he said. "His body was found at the Tin Lizzie," he told Mary. "Oh," is all Mary said. She then went back to bed as if nothing had happened. At about 1 a.m., Chief Inspector James Dobson of the CID was awoken from his sleep. Such late-night calls usually meant one thing: death or destruction. He was informed that a young lad named Brian Howe had been stabbed. Dobson got out of bed and drove to what was now almost certainly a murder scene. This was strange, 2 dead kids in Scotswood in a matter of months. He thought about Martin, the young boy whose death he'd not been able to get off his mind. He never felt comfortable calling that one an accident, and now there was another dead kid almost exactly the same age. Something wasn't right here. The pathologist confirmed the boy had been dead for a few hours. There were scratches on his face and around his neck. Marks on his nostrils seemed to suggest someone had pinched them. He also had scratches around his scrotum, which could suggest a possible sexual element to the crime. He'd been stabbed 6 times in total. The puncture wounds were on his calves, legs, and back. It looked as if he'd suffered a prolonged torture. The pathologist, Dr. Bernhard Tomlinson, said the cause of death was likely strangulation, but whoever had done it hadn't applied much pressure. So he said he doubted the killer was an adult. He also said the other injuries, the scratches and the puncture wounds, weren't very serious. It was as if someone had practiced stabbing him, not shoving the blade in very far. They were the kinds of wounds a child might inflict on another child, said Tomlinson. He reckoned the time of death was anywhere between 3:30 and 4:30, but he couldn't be sure. This was after he'd been seen playing with the girls and long after Rita had smacked him and packed him off with biscuits. They sent the body to Newcastle General Hospital for further tests. Brian's stepbrother Albert Howe was the one who had to identify the body. He was crying already when he met with Dobson at the hospital and almost collapsed in tears when he saw the body. Detective Dobson later said that they set up a murder room and police worked through the night. Detectives from all over the region helped. They worked night and day, sleeping at the station for 8 days. After all, this was a child murder, enough to send the public over the edge. They visited 1,200 houses in Scotswood and talked to every child in every house. One of those kids must have seen something. The kids still played outside, but now they hung out in groups. Fear pervaded the town. Who's next? People wondered. After the preliminary interviews, the detectives looked at the statements that stood out. Norma Bell's name came up. The policeman who'd talked to her had written down, "I thought Norma was peculiar. She was continually smiling as if it was a huge joke." Her mother kept saying, "Didn't you hear what he asked? Answer the question." In her final statement, Norma had said, "The last time I saw Brian Howe was about 12:45 p.m. Wednesday the 31st of July, 1968, when he was playing with his brother and 2 little girls on the corner of White House Road and Cross Hill Road. I cannot say who the little girls were." Norma said she then went to make pom-poms with 2 other girls. The police interviewer had written "verified" next to the pom-pom part. That could have meant that when Brian was murdered, Norma had an alibi, but she was certainly one of the last people to see him that day. That same cop then went next door to speak to Mary Bell. He said in that house something just didn't feel right. He wrote in his report, "No feeling of a home, just a shell, very peculiar. The only life one felt was that big dog barking." Mary was the most evasive child I'd ever come across. He didn't know it then, but he'd been talking with a very special case, a girl who knew how to manipulate adults. He also wrote, and her father was very odd. I asked him, you be her father? And he said, no, I am her uncle. Where are her parents? I asked, and he answered, she's only got a mother and she's away on business. All the questions I had asked her, she was continually looking at him for guidance. In Mary's statement, she said, I last saw Brian Howe in White House Road about 12:30 p.m. Wednesday, the 31st of July, 1968, when he was playing with his brother. I did not go near railway lines or the waste ground near there at all on Wednesday, the 31st, July, 1978. I've been down there before, but it was at least 2 months ago. There was no way to verify this as of yet. The constable doing the interviews had that sixth sense cops often get. Something just didn't feel right about these girls. So he went back to see Norma, and she added a little extra to her statement. She said, about 3:15 p.m. that day, I went out the back way and met Mary. We crossed our back garden, went up the garden path, and into White House Road, and we just played in the street until about 5 p.m. As far as I know, Mary just went into her house. I didn't see her again until 7 p.m. in the back lane behind our house when she was on her own. So what had Mary been doing until 7 p.m.? The next day, August 2nd, Detective Sergeant Doherty went to see Mary, having found inconsistencies in her answers. Mary added now quite a lot to her story. She said actually she had seen someone with Brian. She said it was a boy whose name she didn't know. She said the boy had hit Brian in the face. She explained this kid had pulled out some broken scissors and stuck Brian with them. For good measure, she added, and I saw him trying to cut a cat's tail off with those scissors. What was extremely revealing for the police was the scissors found next to Brian's body had not been in any of the news reports and not in any of the photographs. So either Mary was telling the truth about a delinquent feline-hating psycho boy, whom she said was probably 8, or she herself had used those scissors. It was obvious that she knew something very important. And Norma was by no means out of the woods. Several kids and other witnesses had said that they had saw Mary and Norma together with that horrible ferocious Alsatian, and this was at a time when Norma had claimed to have not been with Mary. The police went to see Mary again. This time she was the only one in the house. Her supposed uncle, she said, was at the pub, and her mom, well, she had no idea where her mom was. The cops felt this was strange. This wasn't your normal household. They went next door, and this time Norma looked pale. She was shaking, especially when Chief Inspector Dobson had told her, anything you say may be taken down in writing and may be given in evidence. Dobson, who'd been informed that she wanted to talk to the police again, having already seen that she'd made a few contradictory statements, said to her, I understand that you have something you want to tell me about the death of Brian Howe. She did. She had a lot to tell him. She said the day before Brian died, she and Mary had gone down to the Tin Lizzie to play. She explained, when I went into the blocks, I tripped over something. I looked down and I saw it was Brian's head. He was covered in grass, but I could see all of his face. He was dead. She added, his lips were purple. Mary ran her fingers along his lips. She said that she had enjoyed it. Norma explained how Mary had told her that she'd held his nose and lips and watched him die, and that she'd taken pleasure in this. Norma further explained, Mary showed me a razor and she said she'd cut his belly. She pulled his jersey up and showed me the tiny cut on his belly. She hid the razor under a block and told me not to tell my dad or she would get in trouble. The police took her back to the site where Brian had been killed, and sure enough, there was a razor where Norma said Mary had hidden one. The cops got her to lie down in the position that Brian had died in, and she did it exactly how Brian had been found. She later gave a full statement with her dad at her side at the police station. It was shocking. Mary, according to Norma, was obsessed with death. At the end of the statement, Norma added a bit extra, saying, when we were looking at Brian on Wednesday, Mary said she was not frightened of dead bodies because she had seen a few. I didn't tell anybody about it because I was frightened, and if I had snitched, Mary could have taken anyone else's child. The police went to Mary's house that same night. Billy was drunk again watching TV. He barely even looked the police in the face when he told them Mary was sleeping, and if they wanted to go talk to her, they damn well better go get her themselves and dress her, because he wasn't going to do it. And no, he said her mom isn't here. He was still claiming to be her uncle at this point. The police took Mary to the station. Billy didn't bother going, so a woman, a so-called responsible adult, took care of Mary. After a series of questions, Dobson said, I have reason to believe that when you were in the blocks with Norma, you showed her something, which you said you had done something to Brian with. I never, screamed Mary, pausing and then saying, I'll kill her. This was perhaps not the best reaction, considering what the interview was all about. It's always me you come for, she whined. Norma's a liar. She always tries to get me into trouble. She kept this up for hours on end, which was indeed impressive for such a young girl. She was also very smart and used words that children didn't usually use. At one point, she told the shocked detective, "You're trying to brainwash me. I will get a solicitor to get me out of this." The police had to let her go. Norma then made another statement, adding more to the story about what they had done to Brian's body. Even so, the detective still didn't have enough to charge Mary. Then the day came of Brian's funeral. His casket was taken down the street with all the neighbors out watching. Mary was there, as was Detective Dobson, who didn't take his eyes off her. He later said Mary Bell was standing in front of the house when the coffin was brought out. She stood there laughing and rubbing her hands. I thought, my God, I've got to bring her in. She'll do another one. Mary then made another statement. This one was rather more telling. She explained that she and Norma had taken Brian out that day and they'd all ended up at the wasteland. It was there, she said, that this happened. Norma started to feel up and down his neck. She squeezed it hard. You could tell it was hard because her fingertips were going white. Brian was struggling and I was pulling her shoulders, but she went mad. And I was pulling her chin up, but she screamed at me. By this time, she had banged Brian's head on some wood or corner of wood, and Brian was lying senseless. Mary said Norma had told her, "This is the first, but it'll not be the last." Norma and she then went back to the street where they got hold of some scissors, and then they returned to the body, and Norma, not Mary, started cutting Brian. She told Dobson, "I had done nothing. I haven't got the guts. I couldn't kill a bird by the neck or throat or anything. It's horrible that." Funnily enough, in a few years' time, Mary would have had a very sickening bird story told about her, and she'd have a run-in with some hamsters, but let's stay in the present for now. She said Norma had wanted them both to run away, or get taken away to a children's home, which was strange to Dobson given it was Mary's household that was starved of love, not Norma's. The woman who'd been there as a responsible adult for Mary couldn't believe what she'd seen. She told Dobson she felt nothing. "I've never seen anything like it," she said, telling him Mary spoke like an adult, using adult vocabulary, and that it all seemed like a game to her. She, of course, wondered what the hell this girl had experienced at home to turn out this way. At the time, Mary's mom, Betty, was still away in Glasgow, so it was hard to get a read on Mary's home life. It was obvious her uncle, Billy, didn't care much at all. Later that night, Mary was brought in and charged with Brian's murder. She looked at Dobson and smiled and said, "That's all right with me." Norma was also arrested. After being charged, she said, I'll pay you back for this." She was crying like a little girl. She cried all night. Mary barely even looked rattled. In fact, when two policewomen visited the girls later, who were now in adjoining cells, Mary seemed excited. She told the women that Mr. Dobson had been so kind to buy them fish and chips. She was most concerned about having holes in her shoes for her court date. She told one of the women, "What will the people think if they see me like this?" This was strange for a little girl, but stranger was the fact that Mary didn't sleep at all that night. She sat up singing a song. Mary was indeed like no other child the authorities had ever seen. She had no remorse for what she had done. She seemed to think it was amusing. What each girl had done was still unclear, but it was certain that they'd committed a terrible act. That part of the investigation was ongoing. Of course, psychiatrists came and spoke to them. Norma was like any other kid, but Mary was an anomaly of a child. She was bright, devious, and calculating, sometimes seemingly endowed with the mind of someone many years older. Yet Norma was below average intelligence. "I've seen a lot of psychopathic children," Dr. Orton, who saw Mary several times, said later, "but I've never met one like Mary, as intelligent, as manipulative, or as dangerous. I knew a lot about her family, about her mother, from the probation people." So what about Mary's mysterious mother, who didn't even bother to turn up at the police station at this point? It turned out that she was a sex worker who specialized as a dominatrix, which is why she spent a lot of time in Glasgow. Whether Billy was Mary's father or not was a mystery and would remain a mystery. Likely he wasn't. He certainly didn't give much of a damn about Mary. Mary's life was a living hell, it turned out. But this wasn't the end of the story, and Mary, traumatized or not, was still a killer. She was a very calculating and cruel girl. There were still many more lies and scandals down the road for her. The trial exposed that the handwriting on those notes left at the school after Martin had died matched with Mary's. The evidence pointed toward Mary being the killer, the disturbed party, and Norma being under her wicked spell. It was argued that Mary had been the dominant party in these crimes, but in her defense, it was also argued that such a terrible upbringing had disturbed the development of her mind. At this moment in time, with no books yet written about Mary, Very little was actually known about her terrible upbringing. Her mom, now in court, Billy, and all their relatives didn't breathe a word about the worst of it. Sure, she was very smart, but she didn't seem to know what was right and what was wrong. Was she also a victim? The British media didn't see it that way, calling the girls monsters who deserved to remain in prison for the rest of their lives. Some of the headlines included the words bad seeds, evil birth, and child monster. So would Mary be found guilty? The question hung largely on just who and what Mary Bell was. Was she really the cold-hearted psycho child the press said she was? Or was she a victim of a horrific upbringing in which she'd created a fantasy world to escape reality? Dr. David Westbury, a home office psychiatrist, had said during the trial that Mary had a psychopathic disorder. The trial also exposed just how rotten so many poor kids had it in northern England. But then again, poor kids usually didn't murder for fun. Mary did have people who loved her grandmother and her aunts, Kath, Isa, and Audrey. Her uncles, Philip and Jack, were all described as intelligent, hardworking, and good people in the book we mentioned. Even so, they all had a secret that compelled Aunt Audrey to tell the author of that book that they were all to blame for what happened to Mary. They'd all hidden the ugly truth at the time of the trial. Mary's mom, Betty, had grown up in Glasgow, desperately poor. She worked in a rope factory as a child and became pregnant while still a teenager. Her first words when Mary was born were, "Take this thing away from me." Nurses tried to put Mary in her arms, and Betty looked repulsed, turning her face away, refusing to touch Mary. "We couldn't believe it. We just couldn't believe it," said one of Mary's aunts. When Mary was a child, one of those aunts was called to the hospital. Poor Mary was having her stomach pumped again. When the aunt arrived, Betty, looking angry, told her, "Don't believe her," meaning Mary. "She says I gave her those pills." Had Betty tried to overdose her own daughter and kill her? Had she tried this before? When the doctors asked Mary what had happened, she told him, "Me ma'am gave me the Smarties." A week later, the aunt talked with Mary's best friend, a 5-year-old. The girl told the aunt Mary's ma'am gave her the Smarties in the backyard. She said she saw it with her own eyes. That same girl a while later was playing out with Mary when she was hit by a bus and killed. All Mary knew was trauma. Her entire young life was a story of trauma. Was it a coincidence then when Martin Brown died that day that Mary kept talking about the time that her mom gave her those pills? Martin's cause of death was never confirmed, but pills were certainly not out of the question. Had Mary done to Martin what her mom had done to her? This was one of those dark secrets that the family kept from the courts. Was Betty trying to kill her own daughter? Or, goes another theory, did she have Munchausen's by proxy? And did she prescribe pills to Mary that Mary didn't need? On December 17, 1968, after over 3 hours of deliberation by the jury, the court clerk asked, "Members of the jury, are you all agreed upon your verdict?" "We are," came the response. Norma Bell, of the murder of Martin Brown, not guilty, they said. Of the manslaughter of Martin Brown, also not guilty. Norma clapped and smiled. Her dad put his hand on her head and gently turned her toward the judge, where she should still be looking. "Do you find Mary Flora Bell guilty or not guilty of the murder of Martin Brown?" asked the clerk, to which the jury foreman replied, "Guilty of manslaughter." And through loud sobs of Mary, he said, "Because of diminished responsibility." She was found not guilty of the murder of both the boys, but guilty of manslaughter. Mary cried for joy. Billy and Betty were there. Betty looked slightly relieved. Billy sat with his head in his hands. None of them said anything to Mary or even hugged her. They barely even looked her way. The entire courtroom understood only too well that this girl was on her own. She'd always been on her own, but that didn't mean that she wasn't a very sick child. The only person to speak to Mary right after the verdict was her solicitor, David Bryson, who whispered something in her ear. During the sentencing, Mr. Justice Cusack described Mary, Britain's youngest killer, as a dangerous individual. He said she posed a very grave risk to other children, and for that reason needed to be taken out of society indefinitely. He explained to the court, "It means that the position can be considered from time to time, and if it becomes safe to release that person can be released. If the state saw fit, she would stay in prison forever." While locked up, Mary saw a slew of psychiatrists who usually said that she was a psychopath. There's a theory that one of the causes of psychopathy could be when young children become so badly traumatized that somehow their brains turn off emotions to protect them. Nonetheless, she certainly felt enough to tell the authorities at one point that she never wanted to see her mom again. She did see Billy. She actually visited him in prison when he was then serving time for armed robbery. She wept after telling one of the people in her unit, "I saw my dad in that place. It isn't a nice place at all." Was this highly intelligent girl a psychopath? She was certainly very sick. Officials where she was housed later said they'd given Mary hamsters to look after, and at some point, they were all found dead. Their necks had been wrung by human hands. One of her teachers was quick to defend her, saying, "But she has a budgerigar. She hasn't killed that, has she?" That was hardly the best defense. She remained manipulative, stating on some occasions that men at the special unit where she was kept had been the perpetrators of sexual misconduct. But it seems the evidence didn't hold up. She made a few such accusations, but in a trial in court, it was proven that she had lied in what looked like a deviant fantasy to all those watching. Her testimony showed glaring inconsistencies. It was obvious the lurid accusations were false. The prosecution had to withdraw the case, after which Judge William Openshaw directed the jury to find the defendant not guilty. She has told 4 stories, the judge told the court, and having told 4 stories, it is inconceivable that the jury would believe any one of them. She has fabricated. She is a very sick child. One can only hope that she can be given treatment to help here. Could such a sick child ever live a normal life outside of special units and prisons? Would Mary ever be free of the psychopathy that caused so much damage to people who came into contact with her? Could someone so unloved ever love someone else? In 1976, it looked like that was possible. Mary had been transferred to an open prison where she was studying a secretarial course. But later that year, with security lax, she tried to escape with another prisoner. They both stayed in hotels in the northern seaside town of Blackpool, where they played games in amusement arcades. Mary made up for a life without sex by sleeping with a strange man, an ex-con. In 1977, he sold his story to the press, telling the world there were no evil demons in her when we made love. Mary was by then 20. The man said they made love all night long. For Mary, it was the first time and she enjoyed getting her rocks off. But when this later came out, it appalled much of the British public. Mary and her accomplice, a sex worker from nearby Leeds, dyed their hair and wore disguises, but it didn't work. They were both arrested and sent back to prison, where Mary was handed another 28 days. In 1980, she got out. She was given a new name with which to start her new life. In 1984, she gave birth to a daughter, who would be her only child. The daughter had no idea who her mom really was until 1998, when news reporters discovered where she and Mary were living. The reporters got hold of Mary's lover, a man the Observer reported as a 40-year-old Geordie with a ponytail, tattoos, and a lived-in look. The article said he cried and drank whiskey and a beer as he poured his heart out. According to the article, Mary was the gentlest person he had ever met. He loved her so much it hurt to be parted. She had always wanted to work with children. Writer Gitta Sareny, who was criticized by some for bringing Mary's story back to life that year, also said Mary lived with a lot of guilt over what she had done in her childhood. In 2003, the Bells won a decision in court to keep their anonymity forever. According to Sareny, in later life, Mary hasn't tried to deny what happened, but she has attempted to address the reasons why she was the way she was. Mary didn't think she was a freak of nature, as the press often said, but a consequence of what can happen when seeds are planted into the most toxic of environments. When Mary turned 16 and was sent to a women's prison, she wrote to a friend saying, "The absolute enormity of my crime has suddenly dawned on me, that I have actually taken a life. I just cannot bear to hardly think of it." Was Mary Bell cured? Is she cured? Because she's out there right now, possibly watching this video. With that in mind, maybe you should have a look at Most Evil Kids in the History of Mankind, or These Countries Were Home to the Worst Serial Killers.